All right. Hey, Candy, you joined in good time.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
All right, I think I'll make another minute just to see if anybody else pops in, but I think we probably got everybody. I hope you feel better soon, Candy, because
Yes, please feel better soon.
I know what that sounds like. It was allergies or something else, but I've had both that bad before.
Yeah. Yeah, I just got back from Phoenix. So that's about a 2.5 hour drive for me. And the altitude change really got my sinuses. So, yeah.
One watching now. Okay. All right. I think I'm good. So I guess go ahead and start. So from the introduction to science of logic, I starts off with going to the general notion of the logic, where he starts off with kind of coming on with the common understanding of the time of how thought and understanding works. In a sense, it is a reflective idea of understanding, where in a sense they came to the conclusion that sensuous reality is what's ultimately the truth, and thought as it's understood in our head are just, because of them being an abstraction, or essentially empty forms that don't really have any real objective reality to them. In that sense, they're actually, trying to think of the right word there for a second, but they're abstractions in that sense. So in this process, he kind of says he kind of comes to it because as it tried to kind of go through its determinations or its determinate categories, it saw a contradiction, but because of an assumption that a logical contradiction is inherently problematic, they came to a conclusion that thought itself didn't hold anything real. Therefore, they suck reality back in purely in a empirical, sensuous reality. Which at that point, then you have a reality that is in fact kind of an alien. There's an alien other out there, as in sort of in reflection back to us, instead of anything that we can really connect with. In this sense, there is, I guess you can argue, there is a form of logical contradiction that would prove to be a problem in the method, because what we've learned when we go through the process here is a dialectical contradiction, is that, say, if you go from the same viewpoint and get two different answers, and yes, there's certainly something wrong in that contradiction. But if you're viewing two different same thing from two different viewpoints, and you see a contradiction, it doesn't inherently mean that it's wrong. It just means that you don't have the full truth of the thing in front of you, and you use that, through that contradiction, you learn more about the objects, which we'll get more into in the process that comes up later. So in this process, it leaves thought purely as an empty form, completely divorced from the objects it's trying to understand. And of course, those objects themselves, according to Hegel, are themselves divorced from each other, and it's each of its own sphere, completely disconnected from each other. That means you can get to the point where pretty much you can have an idea where somebody has complete true conceptions about all of these appearances, but as their appearances, they really know nothing, because appearances are not true. These forms, well, they were considered, insufficient to understand the thing itself, are still held onto and used as the basis for subjective logic, which we're going to. So it fails to really truly understand the thing in itself, as they try to probe further and further using it, simply because as a fixed conception, they're pretty much just empty forms. and they're not, instead of in their lively unity with each other. So therefore, you're pretty much just sort of yielding a hammer basically against everything that looks like a nail. But at that point, do you even know what a nail is? It's pretty much everything. Then Hegel kind of hints back to his phenomenology of spirit, which he does show that in the process of consciousness trying to understand its object, there's a kind of back and forth, and again, in the sense of dialectical connection where not just in the subjective concept where all you're doing is looking at a static object in itself, that your thought process has to grasp around more and more in different ways, try to get closer to the truth. There's a kind of back and forth as that your conception of the object as you see it changes along with your knowledge of it, which then feeds back to your conception, to your perception of the object, and back and forth. Which eventually ends in what he calls the end-all concept, which is the absolute knowing that, in fact, the subject and object are not different from each other. One thing he does bring up in this, though, is that there is a historical presupposition in this, in that the humanity has to go through the process of learning more, kind of going through it. Again, the concepts he shows in the phenomenology of spirit, the shapes of consciousness as it evolves to the point of absolute knowing, to be able to even go back through the logic in this process. But that's not a logical presupposition. It's only historical. It could be shown out, and he says it, and he shows it. We say shows it does in the phenomenology of spirits, that it logically is necessary. That if you were to go through this process, you have to reach this point. I mean, it's possible you could get stuck in the basic understanding, or the Kantian kind of understanding, and never truly reach absolute knowing. But logically, it's still possible to get past that point to absolute knowing. Again, going back to his conclusion phenomenology of spirit being that the subject-object duality itself, again, is not itself separate, but interesting in the unity and absolute knowing. Again, this is the ending of the otherwise perpetual alien other, meaning we are capable of grasping what we were considering the thing of itself, which is itself, as it's no longer alien, we see that's pretty much what's in our head. In this, we get started in moving from subjective thinking to objective thinking, which, again, at this point, the truth is no longer an external thing, external to thought. Truth in this process, so we learn, it need not necessarily remain in a physical form. As stated before, Kantianism was a requirement, which at this point, it's also not the same thing like the Platonic ideals. Well, that is a abstract concept, but again, that doesn't have to be real like Plato thought it was. But in this process, we only find that in its notion, is there any real graphs of anything that comes actualized? Because in a sense, an essence without a sense of being has no real reality. And being without understanding its essence is just something out there we don't understand. There was a quote I thought was going to bring up here. And this course also, thought is an expression which attributes the determination contained therein primarily to consciousness. So at this point, thought isn't just like I said, it's not an empty form, it's not an empty method that we go through. It is, in fact, itself of and for consciousness that is used to further the development of its own understanding. Just trying to think on this part. It goes, it's a subject, because at this point, logic as it has been understood since Aristotle's time was pretty much a static thing that even to a certain extent, he said, kind of had some more and more removed from it, became less. Therefore, it really looked like we need at this point, we need a full reconstruction of the logic to fully grasp it. And
Exactly.
objective thinking allows us to do such a thing. Okay, I can't read my own writing. Inadequate in comparison to how the other. Then at this point, so it is. At this point, part of it is also inadequate to science for the logic itself to the science at present, because it's such an empty form as an empty applicable method. It ended up becoming rote memorization as taught in classes at his time. There's no scientific method to be found in this. Nothing really even applicable to move forward in philosophy. So he's found in trying to go through the exposition of the logic himself in this reconstructive process, he does end up finding the dialectical nature, again, derived itself in a living form as through consciousness. So in this case, shoot, lost my train of thought.
It's okay. Take your time.
Yeah. Yeah, so in this sense, because it being derived, necessarily shows the law of contradiction itself is not necessarily true. And of course, this process of the dialectics is, in a sense, each sense of the notion itself is faced with the negation of itself, but it's not a null, like a null negativity where it ends up canceling itself out. It's
Right.
a negativity from a different perspective, which itself, through the unity of these two, of both this of this and its negative, comes out as a through itself to a new thing, ends up being positive. So in this sense, it's a self-development, a self-motivation forward. So this movement is not external as something that's applied to it. It's something that comes inherently from itself. It's where the movement comes from itself. And because of this, each step itself, while being a form itself, does have a form of content at each step that itself turns into a form only because it's found to be only a part of a unity of the next content. At this point, he kind of starts getting into referencing that the structure of the book coming up is determined only because you're able to look back at it historically as the end result. It's not something determined ahead of time. It's not like, and he gives examples coming up. Well, here's how I'm going to apply this method. Here's when I apply this particular judgment. Here's how I'm going to apply this particular judgment. It just shows up because it itself is inherently determined through the development of the notion or the concept. And even brought up, even Kant declared that the dialectic as a necessary function of reason and not something arbitrary, as was described a certain earlier version of dialectic that was attributed to sophistry, because one could use negation in that sense. And without this inner negation resolving through you get only through the negative, you resolve only through the negative, you don't continue along to a net positive unity of the two. You basically kind of get stuck in an unknowable concept. You cannot know infinity that you reach out to. It's kind of a sense that a bad infinity.
Yeah.
But again, in the unity, you do get to move along to an understanding of an infinite, to a better unity, better infinity, which then you end up getting yet again another implication of the notion as it moves along.
Mm.
And of course, he goes through the process of describing where at the start, it kind of seems a bit arbitrary. You're not really know where you're going. By the end of it, you can see the entire process as basically kind of a living thing that you can go through and better understand. he's at this point though, what is different between this philosophy as science in this sense and the other sciences though, is that he says that the world of logic is the realm of shadows, because at this point we're moving purely in abstraction. But again, as defined, as will be shown, that the subject-object dichotomy is not as such, but is a unity in the absolute knowing. That is what allows us to think in these concepts in the first place as something actual that gets actualized at the end. And by going through this process, it does in fact essentially keep the contingency that we usually throw at certain points at bay, because everything shows up as derived.
Yeah.
Right. And then through the divisions, pretty much again determined through the process, each determination and judgment evolves naturally from the notion prior to it. And in this, we see the notion in two concepts of both the in itself and for itself. The in itself is pretty much just sort of being, while the notion for itself, which has gone through a mediation process, is the notion in itself. And as such, there has to be a mediation process, which we will find is through reflection, is the essence of being. Which seems at this point, again, going back to dialectical, is that the notion itself is the unity of being and essence.
Yeah.
And yeah. And then again, that's what he talks about, the three, that's why he has the three, well, what was his term again? The doctrine of being, doctrine of essence, and doctrine of notion. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. Wonderful job. All right. So we're going to kick off Stack. I would say I'm going to go next, but honestly, I'm going to let someone else talk because I will monopolize the time if I start. So unless no one else has anything to say,
Yeah.
It's open.
Yeah, I'm repeating what I said on Facebook last week.
Yeah.
Hegel, describes the science of logic in relation to earlier systems of philosophy. He talks about traditional metaphysics, including like the metaphysics of the medieval scholastics, and presumably he also including the metaphysical systems of the earlier modern philosophers like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and Hegel says, well, you can see that human content fatally undermine those earlier kinds of metaphysics, and Hegel says that moving forward, his own science of logic will perform the functions that the traditional metaphysical systems had performed. So his science of logic was not just logic, in the sense like Aristotle. It was intended to lay out a system and an ontology. So for Hegel, the categories are not simply categories of logic; they are ontological categories as well. And in that way, the science of logic will, basically replace traditional metaphysics. And is another important aspect of it is Hegel's critique of Kant. And Kant, after destroying traditional metaphysics, argued that, that given the distinction Kant drew between the phenomenal realm, which is knowable through perception, and the noumenal realm, which is really unknowable. It's the things. It's the realm of the things in themselves. For Kant, God, the human soul, and free will were all existed in the noumenal realm. None of those things, we cannot really know those things to exist. But for Kant, we could justify belief in them because he saw those as necessary presuppositions of the moral life. Now Hegel disagreed with that approach because he rejected the notion of the unknowable thing in itself. So for Hegel, Hegel does talk about God and the soul and stuff, but they're not unknowable things in themselves, and more controversial for Hegel is he is basically redefining God. It's not really the God of traditional religion. Hegel's God is actually very similar to Spinoza's God, which had been regarded as heresy and atheism in its day, and some of Hegel's critics made the same charges against him too. So, not without justification.
And long after his death too.
Yep.
Absolutely. Okay, I put myself on Stack. I'm just gonna make a few comments and then open up Stack again. In the introduction, the introduction is a dizzying piece of literature, and I've read it several times, and each time it's been different. But I took a break from it for a few months, and I read it twice this week, and I realized just how daunting a task it is for Hegel to both define what he's going to do, as well as sort of tell you what the shape of it is after it's finished. Because so you have the general notion of logic, right? And so he starts talking about what logic is, what phenomenal consciousness is, the position of ancient metaphysics he touches on, as well as the common sense sort of defeat of philosophy in his own day by both common sense and philosophy in the form of Kant, which basically says you can't really know anything objectively, and so just turn to subjective, whatever, and it'll be fine. This retreat from reason leaves the thinker with the shallow consolation of the world of appearances only, and it reminds me of what Marx termed the commodity fetish in Marx's Capital. Most people live their day-to-day lives. They get up in the morning, they go to work, and they come home, raise their kids, pay for school, pay for all the things, and they live roughly in the world of appearances, where the commodity is pretty much as you see it, as it appears. And there's so much more to it beneath the surface, but we can't know that, says Kant's philosophy, and so we have to go with the consolation. The criticism of the forms of the understanding, the criticism of the forms of the understanding is that the thing in itself cannot correspond to them, which, while true, are retained in the subjective only realm. The problem is subjective thought, unable to account for the object, ends up not being able to represent the subject at all, and the whole scheme collapses, right? Which is why when Hegel's talking about how metaphysics has basically been derided as unusable, and logic just sort of a school exercise you give to kids, and then you forget about it when you go back into the real world. I mean, this was the the real reality in Hegel's day. Logic was reduced to forms and nothing more. So he has to build up this idea of the notion of science and the category of the notion without going through the progression in the introduction, right? And so, like I said, it's difficult, and he focuses. I'll try to finish up real quick. Sorry. He focuses on the movement. So he talks about negativity and sublation as the method, and the problem is that the result shows you that the movement of the categories isn't just sort of happening on paper as sort of this ghost in the machine. It's the thinker thinking with the brain, right, who is moving the categories around, but he does not treat them that way. You cannot treat them that way imminently when you start from being. You can't make that presupposition at all. right? That may be the result, but while you're going through it, he cannot write that way, which is why he has to resort to writing that makes it look mystical. And Marx talks about how a lot of Hegel's writing comes off as mystical, and I think this is part of that. In order to account for what is imminent to the system, you can't turn it around and be a materialist in describing it. You have to follow the immanent logic. And after you're done with the system, basically when you're in nature and philosophy of spirit, you can talk about logic as a completed absolute idea that has a fully functioning set of parameters, right? So when you get into the division, he talks about how the main idea is to here. Hang on a second. Okay, the general division, I'm just going to read what I wrote real quick. The general division of the logic is given in this section. Hegel proclaims to be provisional due to the actual division lying in the actual contents. He repeats that the presupposition of the science of logic is the result of the phenomenology of spirit, whereby the self-determining subject and the object it beholds turn out to be one and the same in unity. This unity, as absolute knowing, is abstracted as being, sheer being, the abstract form of the notion, after which the notion will be considered. You can see from here, Hegel is outlining the book. He then explains why a doctrine of essence is necessary, as the distance between being and notion requires a sphere of meditation, of mediation. He says it a lot better than I do. I just kind of paraphrase from my notes. The notion as a system of reflected determinations is derived as the transition from being to notion. So, and he says that essence is still in the objective section because the fully derived notion is the subject fully loaded. Okay, so when we get into the doctrine of the notion, that's subjective, called subjective logic. What it basically means is that you have your how do I want to say this? The notion is self-determining. Being cannot be self-determining, and neither can essence, because those are the parts, those are the cogs that are connected in real life. They will turn out to be connected in the notion and in the absolute idea in the very end of the book. But he can't make that assumption, and he cannot start at the concrete and move to the abstract. We're going in the other, the other direction. And so, at the end of the division of logic, I'll just say this really quick. Hegel briefly reviews Kant's transcendental logic, which was meant to be the subjective portion of his philosophy, and how Hegel's own not only can replace it, but also the former metaphysics, which had no imminent derivation. I just have a quote, and I'll stop. So, page 64. Yeah. At the end of the division of logic, he says the subjective logic is the logic of the notion of essence, which has sublated its relation to being or its illusory being, and in its determination is no longer external, but is subjective, free, self-subsistent, and self-determining. That's the key word, or rather, it is the subject itself, and that gets even closer to what's supposed to be happening. Since subjectivity brings with it the misconception of contingency and caprice, and in general characteristics belonging to the form of consciousness, no particular importance is to be attached here to the distinction of subjective and objective. So just to round this out, he demotes your common understanding of a lot of these formally understood words in the metaphysics. When we say something is subjective or objective, we know what we mean in the common sense of the term. Hegel in the introduction is very explicit in demoting all of these so that he can build them up immanently to mean what the notion contains, not what the history of mankind has sort of built up common sense to be. I'll leave it there. Thanks. Stack is open. And I just want to say to the audience watching, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. Did we lose John?
Yeah.
I'll just ask. Might have had a power outage or something. We've had that before. Go ahead, Doug.
Okay, so you brought up something about common sense. So, and I think it's like paragraph 43. I'm looking at a PDF right now, and he says, okay, well, I'm sorry, no, not 43. Yeah, no, 43. He says, directed against reason, it behaves as ordinary common sense. And he's talking about, I think, the reflective understanding, and imposes view that truth rests on sensuous reality, that thoughts are only thoughts, meaning that it is sense perception which first gives them filling and reality, and that reason left to its own resources only engenders only figments of the brain. And he goes on to say, in this self-renunciation of reason, I'm not going to read that, but it reminds me of what Gramsci said about common sense. And he said, common sense takes countless different forms. Its most fundamental characteristic is that it is a conception which, even in the brain of one individual, is fragmentary, incoherent, and inconsistent, in conformity with the social and cultural position of those masses whose philosophy it is. So common sense, common sense is, again, fragmentary. It can mean, brush your teeth, before you go to bed. Always, take your vitamins. But it can also mean, all Jews are money grubbers, women can't drive. So it contains these very contradictory ideas. Unions are good, immigrants are bad, or, whatever. So, but it's not coherent. It can be very inconsistent even in a single person. And we can see that with people we know. And obviously, reason, speculative philosophy is meant to make your views coherent, to raise you up. There's a quote from Lenin, it's like the job, revolutionaries need to we can't descend to the level of amateur, but raise the amateur to the level of revolutionary. And that's, what philosophy is meant to do. It's meant to the best of its ability, raise you up, to get you to think coherently, rationally, as opposed to, say, maybe, praying over an illness, you instead actually go to a doctor and, get prescribed medicine. Instead of viewing, as our fate is already decided because of God or some other divine force, is that there are actually social and material causes for that are not actually beyond comprehension. And reason allows you to do that, which is like why this type of thinking is, especially in Hegel, who develops it, brings it up to 11, or as he would say, absolute knowledge, in a way that ties everything together. It's just like the rug in the Big Lebowski, ties the whole room together and everything. And once you can have that rational, coherent view, you can lose all these inconsistencies. You can get rid of the fragmentary. You can actually raise yourself to think at the level of the absolute. And I know we talked about this when we read the Encyclopedia Logic, but it's something Hegel says is not beyond the mental capacity of any human being who's willing to undertake the effort, which again is like why this is always seen as very subversive whenever it comes up. You know, it's like, oh my, it's the root of godlessness and everything. It's gonna dethrone God, and we're like, yeah, of course, sure, we're hoping, we're trying. So anyhow, hopefully some of that made sense. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doug. I'm just going to put my stack on, or I'm going to put myself on stack for a really quick comment because I started to say something and then I lost it. But I mentioned that just really quick, that Hegel talks on a lot of abstractions about what's going on with the categories and the logic. And in the introduction, he's having to talk about these things, and it's very hard to see exactly what's going on. So he talks about negativity and how the category disappears and mutates into the next one. What he doesn't tell you, because what's actually the wider context of why it's negative and then has the positive result. He described it in like half a page in the preface, preface 2, how the process works. But he doesn't make very much or at all reference. No, he does. It's the syllogism. That's what it is. But he can't mention it. He can't read the standard syllogism into what he's talking about. And so all he can talk about, hold fast in its abstraction, are the categories and their movement. But they're moving because they're moving along the circuit. And I'm using this word specifically because we're reading Capital Volume 2. The categories, especially in being, are moving along the circuit of the syllogism. And at the level of being, they're individual, they're singular. When they hit the negation, they disappear as the individual or the particular and re-show up. And he narrates this. They re-show up as themselves, but sublated. In other words, part of the universal, but also part of what it actually is in its, further development. The problem is that it's difficult. Well, the book refuses to read into the early categories, the later categories, and I think it's smart because, like he said, Aristotle's logic was over 2,000 years old at the time. And, anyone who would be familiar with all of this stuff, if he starts talking about how you're going through the circuit of the syllogism, it's probably going to come to a different result based on external standards, I want to say, versus the immanent one. And he says it's got to be immanent down the line or it's no good. Stack is open.
Hey, Doug had raised the, it referenced both Hegel and Gramsci in terms of developing critiques of common sense. But it should be pointed out now that philosophers have been doing that ever since Socrates, basically. In Plato, drew a distinction between what he called the way of truth and the way of opinion. The way of opinion was basically, what the representative the inconsistent philosophies to say of common folk, whereas the way of truth was what philosophers is supposed to represent a higher intellectual development. Philosophers overcome all the contradictions and inconsistencies that are manifest in common sense. And for Plato, that certainly implied political elitism, in his ideal society, the philosophers would be the governing elite, and below them there'll be the what do you call? I think they call them the democracy. They would be like administrators and soldiers who would be subordinate to the philosophers. Then below them be all the common folk, including workers, merchants, and peasants, and so forth. But when you get into the modern era with Hegel and his successors, they're not necessarily trying to promote elitism, because he said Hegel said almost anybody could rise to this level if they apply themselves to it. And certainly the Marxists thought that even ordinary workers could do this. In the Marxist groups, they've always had study groups and educational societies that were intended to raise the intellectual level of the ordinary worker. And that was what Gramsci was talking about too. He was certainly involved in doing that. So for them, philosophy is not something to be reserved for a small intellectual elite. It's for the masses.
Absolutely, it is for the masses. And Hegel comes out specific. He doesn't mention Aristotle's warning in Aristotle's work. I forget which book, but he basically says that philosophy is not for the young and reserve it for the middle-aged to the old. And Hegel comes out and says, look, here are a couple different pedagogies you can use, but here's going to be your result. The young are going to internalize the grammar as sort of a blank, arid form, but at least they'll have it to reference. But if you come back from the sciences, 35, 40 years old, and you have much more experience, and you learn the logic, I mean, you've got the complete package, form and content, both thought and concrete content, and know what to do with it in the syllogism, in the judgment, properly executed. It takes work. Reasoning takes work, but at the same time, if you know the shape of it, know how to God, even talking about it abstractly is difficult, right? Because I usually reference Marx's commodity, in that, you start with this abstract universal and you work toward concrete forms that are actually running through the circuit, which consists of commodity capital, money capital, production capital in its own process, and how it runs through there and the forms change. But it's almost Marx taking the syllogism and turning it on its head, so that the interactions back and forth from the singular to the particular to the universal become akin, sort of family resemblance to the production, the interaction of the production process, the circulation process, and what's the other one, Doug? Was there? I don't know. Maybe it's not one-to-one. The concrete process of capital is not one-to-one with thought. No one should make that exact one-to-one, I think. But our ability to run the subject matter, whether it's art, consciousness, the capitalist mode of production, anything you're looking at it through the judgment and the syllogism correctly, will yield you with a full notion of whatever you're studying. I mean, we talk about the notion, the category, the notion as a self-moving category. But that's the logic. That's the study of thought. If you want to take this ability to reason and start applying it to things like consciousness, you see the result is a complete notion of that subject. I'll stop there. Thanks. Go ahead, Doug. Or
Oh,
did you-
okay. So I guess this is bouncing off Jim a bit and myself. If you follow me on Facebook, you know I've been writing about Mao and the Chinese Revolution a bit. And I have a whole boatload of problems with Mao, but one thing I think he did correctly was trying to popularize his variant of Marxism, in his works like On Contradiction, On Practice. I have a lot of problem with those works, but I don't think it's wrong to popularize like your ideas and philosophical ideas. And that was correct to do. And there's a reason why those two works of his are so widely read, because they're very accessible. And it's a very good thing to do. And there's Maurice Cornforth from the British Communist Party, and his major lectures on dialectical and historical materialism were originally given to courses for members of the party, ordinary workers who just wanted to hear him. And that's always been implied in even if in pretty much all of Marxism and communism, that philosophy is for the masses, is for the working class, and to try and propagate that. And with obviously varying levels of success. And we can question some of the interpretations offered, certainly, but it's and that's something the ruling class doesn't like. Because if you think about the people, and this is going to start tying back to Hegel a bit, if you're thinking about like certain segments of the Enlightenment, people like Voltaire, who could question God, who could question like a lot of established beliefs, but they would just say, this is just for us here in the elite. Don't let the masses hear about this. Don't let them hear that the Bible is false, because then they might riot and do stuff. We got to keep them in their place. But in our own circles, we all know that's crap. But we're going to maintain the basic class structure. And that's part of like why Hegel is so important, is he's like the culmination of this process, going through the radical Enlightenment, from Spinoza, people like Messler, Rousseau. And Hegel just kind of develops it all into a comprehensive total system, which is obviously why like a lot of anti-communists see Hegelianism as like the root of communist totalitarianism. Because he not only develops these insights into a system, but in a way that it serves as this fount for Marxism, for communism. And it's no accident like the great thinkers of communism have all returned to Hegel at various points, particularly when revolutionary struggle heats up. Gramsci, Lukács, Lenin, obviously Marx and Engels, but we could go down the list. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely, and I've been thinking about. I'm just going to put myself back on Stack really quick for just a comment. I've been thinking about this for a while, but I think certain people, I've read certain people comment on Lenin's return to Hegel, on Mao's, use of the dialectic and reason, and they sort of have this expectation that a golden document is going to be born out of this, right? Lenin went on from his study to experience the revolution. He wrote State and Revolution and left communism and a number of other articles, but he was busy with it. And on one side of the spectrum, you have people saying, well, events overtook and he didn't have enough time, and on the other, you get people who try to say that Hegel really probably didn't have that much influence on him after all, even though he wrote an entire conspectus and commentary on the entire book. My interpretation right now, and this is just my opinion, it's just me, is that Hegel lent systemization to Lenin's thought that wasn't there before. And at first, it's going to be really subtle. And Hegel even says this somewhere in the preface or the introduction. Once you give the logic to someone, at first, you're not going to see much of a needle move because, okay, you've given them the form and the content, right? And they sort of know the structure of reason. okay, well, now they have to apply it either to events in their daily life or to things that they're writing or to their studies and whatnot. And that again takes time. And so even if, like, all of us finish the science of logic, there's no guarantee that we will go out and write the golden document. In fact, you know, events being what they are just as strong as our will, if not more, just as Marx said in the 18th Brumaire. And so, you know, it's not a guarantee, but it does have a definite effect. It can sharpen your arguments. You know, you go from I haven't read all the materials, so I'm talking up my butt on this one, but you go from the imperial what's the name of his book, Doug? The imperial criticism book that he wrote, in which he
Lenin?
sort of yes, in which,
Materialism and imperial criticism.
yeah, so he wrote a book talking about Marxism and a couple other people, and just sort of like talking about the different parties in social democracy that have sort of bitten off on this empiricism as a science. And I'm going to guess that some of his arguments were probably he said, she said. Did I say that right? He said, she said. And after reading the logic, I think he probably, I would imagine he would probably have a sharper view on that. He would probably rewrite the book. Well, yes. Go ahead, Doug. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of come around to this position that materialism and imperial criticism has been unfairly maligned. First of all, Lenin republished that book. It was originally published in 1908, and he had it republished in 1920. So this is a few years after he had intensively studied the logic. And in that book, you know, he's focused, I'm going to put it very crudely, it's like he's more focused on dialectical materialism, emphasis on the materialism. And when he writes a few years later, you know, where he takes his notes on Hegel, he's more focused on dialectical materialism with the emphasis on the dialectical. And he's trying to more systematize and develop his philosophy and make it more coherent. And obviously insights do come from that. But I don't think we should view Lenin as some kind of mechanical, you know, non-dialectical thinker beforehand, because he's not at all in his views on politics and class struggle and what have you. So there is a clear line, you know, there's a continuity there from materialism and imperial criticism to, you know, the philosophical notebooks, but there is obviously development in making it more coherent. If you get a chance, first of all, you know, to toot my own horn, you know, the Kautsky book actually does talk a little about, you know, the change from that, but also international publishers just re-released Materialism and Imperial Criticism with a new critical introduction by Helena Sheehan, which kind of goes into some of these issues. And I thought it was pretty decent. And obviously some of her other works do as well. But there is a certain segment of like these very Hegelian Marxists who kind of separate the two works. And on the one hand, it's very good to give credit to the Hegel notebooks, but it's also, you know, I think that earlier work is actually a lot better than some people give it credit for. Hopefully that's not too much off topic, but I do want to defend Lenin where possible.
Yeah, and this is the new one. It's got Helena Sheehan's introduction, and it's very good. I'm kind of showing my butt and having forgotten half of what she talked about. But yeah, Doug is correct. The impression lasts, unfortunately, when people give you information on some of this stuff, and you know, you just have to work through it. Thank you, Doug. Appreciate that. Stack is open. We've got 5 minutes to go. So I just want to say for the broadcast and for us in general, the next reading, oh, yes, absolutely. Here is you can hear me. Yes, good. Here is the book. It's Materialism and Imperial Criticism. It's by V.I. Lenin, of course, but Helena Sheehan has written a new preface to it with who is it? International Publishers. They put it out. They put out an awful lot of literature in general, and they're still going. So this is
They're the Communist Party's publishing house, so they put out like Marx, Engels, Lenin, a lot of CP literature. So they're actually very good if you want like basic Marxist texts. I'll actually find the link and put it in the chat.
Thanks, Doug. And for cheap, like they're not, like scholarly editions that, cost an arm and a leg. They're actually pretty. This one is it on here?
It'll probably be on sale, but it's about $20.
Okay. They used to print the price right on it, and now they don't, apparently. So, oh well. So yeah, Science of Logic. For the next section, for next week, I propose that we read. Hey, yeah, no problem. How far are we going to get? Page 80, 68. It's really only 12 pages, but there's a lot to talk about. There's a section on page 67 called With What Must the Science Begin? And there's an extensive discussion about the beginning and sort of what the science should consist of. And right after that, we dive into the meat of the book. And so I think those 12 pages should be our goal. If for some reason we run out of stuff to talk about in the first 30 minutes, then we can, I don't know, we can, we're not going to, trust me. If this time was any indication. I just want to thank you all very much for coming again today. Does anyone have anything to promote or closing thoughts?
I just want to have a comment to make about materialism and imperial criticism.
Go ahead.
Because many Marxist philosophers have disparaged that book. And on the converse side of it, there have been some notable anti-communist philosophers like Karl Popper and Antony Flew who praised the book. So that's just an interesting side note.
I don't know how to feel about that, Jim. I really don't. I don't like Karl Popper at all. I don't.
And he wouldn't like Antony Flew either because Flew was, he was a very active anti-communist. He was in all these far-right organizations, but he did praise on that book.
I mean, conversely, like a lot of communists have praised that book too. So Ilyenkov from the Soviet Union, a Marxist philosopher, he praised it and wrote some very good essays on it. And unfortunately gets tainted with like a lot of like the Stalinism there, because obviously they're using that. But that taints, like, if you do that, you can just taint everything Marx, Engels, and Lenin said. If you think about it, since that was, the ideological legitimacy for Stalinism.
Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Kyle, if you could, thank you very much for coming, everybody, and we'll see you.